Hello and welcome to Here in Mind. And today's topic, I'm going to talk about possessed by art. And what does that mean? So, when I was a kid, around 5 years old, I had this attraction to drawing and art, mainly painting and, kids draw cartoons and comics, and that's how I sort of got into drawing, was drawing Garfield and unicorns and just cartoon figures mostly. I think it may have come from, I remember my mom liking unicorns a lot, so, you want to impress your parents when you're a kid. So it's mainly not, it's a combination of you have a will to go towards that thing, but also you want to impress your parents and have them give you some kind of approval for a skill you can perform. Because we all want to be accepted. It helps us move forward and feel good about ourselves and gain confidence. So, I remember, some of my first drawings were of unicorns. I had a black poster, of black unicorn. It had some purple in it, and I was just kind of, before it became cliche, it was sort of something I've never seen before. It was kind of a dream landscape, background with purple clouds, black and blue, and then a black unicorn. And when you're 5 or 6, you're kind of enchanted by the form because it's mystical. You never see it in real life, and there are legends and stories, and when you're a kid, you take it literally, not knowing that they're just metaphors for a story or symbolize something. And so, I think what intrigued me was that mom liking some of the things I've done, or parents, grandmother, and so that kept me going. I think that's what you're supposed to do with children, is keep encouraging them. But sometimes, I wouldn't get the encouragement and just be like, oh, maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I need some more practice. So I remember around maybe 7, 8 years old, I started watching a lot of public television. I grew up in Detroit area, so we had a lot of Canadian television. And there was always like Bob Ross in the morning, and there's another guy named Alexander. He was, I believe he was Russian. He was another painter that was a little older. I kind of enjoyed him a little better because he was less basic in his painting methods. Bob Ross, no offense, but it wasn't my style. For some reason, as a child, I was very serious about, I guess, what you call high classical art. I don't know why. I was never introduced to it from a family member or anything. It's just when I saw documentaries on Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or Salvador Dali, those people really captured my mind, because here were people who are Renaissance men. And I think this is what maybe Nietzsche was talking about, the overman. Someone who's a complete person who could do many things: engineer, paint, speak well, politics, rhetoric, all that sort of thing. And that really intrigued me. I'm like, wow, an artist can kind of be anything they want to be. And I was sort of like that because I had ADHD, and I would skip one thing to another, and it took many years to figure out what would hold my attention, and I get moments still where I'm sort of going all over the place. So that really intrigued me, watching PBS and CBC, which are, PBS is obviously, everyone knows that, but CBC is I believe the equivalent in Canadian. I'm not sure if it's public. I think it's regular television in Toronto. And so I got really, really immersed in the lives of these people, because they seem to have lived a life outside of normality. Because it seems like everyone in public, if you just go outside, everyone's kind of in their own thing and sort of doing what's expected of them: pay bills, go to church, go shopping, tend to the family. But that's all sort of these things you have to do, and it's not something you have to think about, really. You're not thinking deep thoughts when you're going to go buy diapers for your child, or you're not philosophizing on the existence of life when you're tending to your mother who's sick in the hospital. So I'm talking about painters and artists and musicians, and anyone in the arts seems to live outside the hierarchy, if you will. obviously we still have to pay bills and so forth, but I feel like, for me personally, I don't let it take over my life. I'm always thinking about it. I always have to write it down so I don't forget to do certain responsibilities, obviously. But for me, that was intriguing because they were like no other human I've ever experienced as a child. I kept seeing adults as people who are bothered by their career. Not all of them, obviously, just the ones some I've experienced. And like, I don't want to be what they look like. I want to be someone who represents an aim that I want to go towards as I get older and be an adult. And when I looked at artists, some were crazy and some were imbalanced because I think they went far too outside the spectrum of being incorporated into a culture and a community. And that's important too. You have to be, I think, first of all, you should be able to step inside both realms as a human being. At least try. You're going to be weaker at one, but I think you have to at least immerse yourself in both realms of being a citizen and then being your soul, spirit, or whatever you want to call it, your true identity. And that takes years to manifest and years to work on, like a muscle. It's a part of your brain that if you focus on it and really take it seriously, you see a difference than if you were just a purely logical person and just based everything on empirical evidence and ones and zeros, which isn't like what we're made of. A lot of us, I think, became victims of our own machinery in a way. I think a lot of people have become computers and become like social media, and their personalities are reflecting that nowadays, which I don't understand why people do that. But again, I do, when I get into music, I'm sure I'm sort of have tendencies of thinking in musical terms, but I'm always thinking about, am I approaching these things correctly, and is it matching with social norms that are created by communities? So I'm always trying to check myself and look outside, not saying, hey, I'm right, my world's correct, and so forth. But anyway, back to being possessed by art, it always seemed like when I would look up to artists, whether musicians or painters, that they were possessed by something. They had an aim, a focus, and this world they created, they just lived in, and nothing could shake them. And I was intrigued by what causes that and why. And to me, it seems like it's something that's inherent in our brain. Your brain hungers for information and knowledge. Depending on your values, you're going to go towards something that may be more on the left brain spectrum, or finance and medical field and sciences. But you still should dance in the realm of the right brain, the creativity, the dream, because that stuff is just as important, if not more so. I forgot the gentleman's name who was talking about the right brain actually being more important to focus on than the left brain. I'm not saying you should deny one side or the other, but it's because a lot of people today, you see, mainly in big cities, at least from my observation, people are too logical and they're uptight and they're very edgy. And I feel like their soul or their spirit hasn't been tended to in a long time because maybe their family or their job looks down upon that stuff or doesn't have any sort of, care for what that stuff could do for people. So, and like I said, I saw that as a child with certain adults. I don't want to be that. And I know at times I have been. There's been chunks in my life where I didn't do much of anything creative for a couple of years here and there. And I realized that's what I actually need for me personally. I think everyone has a different level of what can make them happy and what fulfills them. But you got to make sure you don't base your fulfillment like, yeah, I'm happy, based on your own bias, because that's where the trap is. You need to check yourself against many great thinkers of the past, your family, and popular culture, and on, for some aspect, the underground culture too. But anyway, back to age 7, when I was saying I was just enchanted by these people, and then I started getting more serious into drawing. I would get into drawing nudes and figures, and basically like in a classical style. And then around age 9, my mom took me to oil painting classes. We couldn't even afford really much when I was growing up, and I'm surprised my mom would dished out that much money to do that, and I feel grateful for that, actually. Because oil paints, when I was a kid, were like $15 per tube, if you will, and they may be more now or the same. These were good quality oil paints, and I think it was less than a year I took her classes because she went out of business, my teacher. She was a German lady, and she really wasn't that good. She wasn't focused and really paying attention to what we were doing. But it's still, at least I got an opportunity to see the process unfold. And at that time, I did a lot of landscapes, and I just loved doing it. It was great therapy. I felt good. I met fellow artists that went to my school that were there and became friends. And so, after that was over, I was still just drawing pencil mostly. And, through my life, I found certain artists that felt what I saw feel the same. They're possessed by this thing. And why are we possessed by art, What is this thing that we need? And you can look back at the famous philosophers, Plato being one of them, was talking about how it's very important that we have art. Even though I don't agree with a lot of his philosophy in looking at nature to actually to actually be a part of our reality and our phenomenology. But I do, this one aspect of his teachings were about art and how we need it. And psychologically, I feel like it is part of what you would call the spirit or religious experience. It's been proven that the brain has a section that's for religion or for some kind of spiritual endeavor. And whatever you believe, if you believe it or not, it's there. And that's why most people, I would say, that are atheists or believe more into science or more pragmatic things than people who think of more dreamlike sensations and intuition. They disregard, but what happens is your brain wants something. So what it does is it uses it for material things or people even. And so that works to a point, but then there's always this kind of like... Dr. Jordan Peterson would talk about how there's these quasi-religious things that we embrace instead of actual religion, and that creates sort of like a character that's hobbling with one limb missing or broken, and so you're hobbling along, and it's sort of this, low-resolution version of a true religious endeavor or spiritual endeavor, let's say. And I don't like the word spiritual, but whatever. We need to put a name on it. So we need it. I really, when you're a teenager or young, you have these prejudices towards certain terms because your parents did that thing and it seems odd, or you see that the negative part of certain religions or certain groups and cults, and that's true because I saw the same thing, but I think that the wrong people are in charge of some of these enterprises, if you want to call it that. And it shouldn't be an enterprise held by anyone. It should be something that everyone has an equal part in, and we all do it together. And I think it's sort of like the ceremonial part is missing, and the closest thing I can come to a better version of a church, if you will, would be like concerts, because no one is better than anyone else there in the crowd. You're looking at someone, and that's why I think some young girls look at the performer as a god in some way. But if the artist is a good person, most artists don't, at least I hope, don't think they're gods, except for celebrities maybe, but a really good artist and performer doesn't think that of themselves. They're there with them. And that's what it's supposed to be, is everyone is in on it, but everyone's with each other instead of like some, higher being. Well, they might be like a more enlightened person or have credentials to be more wise, but they don't think that, and no one else should think that. They just think, you're there and I'm trying to aim towards where you are, and we're experiencing all of this together. And I think that's the closest thing we have today. And as you know, it's still kind of, when you pay money to do something like that, a large amount of money, it kind of feels odd to yourself. Like, God, I paid that much money for this experience, and you can't let go of that thing. But I think it, you got to look past that, and also we got to get better at figuring out what that is, because we're hungry for that, obviously. And I think if we refine it more towards something we used to do in the ancient era and now put together, I'm not saying we go revert back or move forward too much. I think we got to blend the two, make it more ritualistic, and allow people to do psychedelics at these parties instead of, I don't believe in hard drugs should be used at any facility because that's a dissociative. I would like to see something more communal, and that may be hippie speaking, but there's something to that. I mean, everyone sees a lot of people broken in large communities that have bad government and bad community and that kind of stuff. So, and I believe that's why we can be possessed by art, because it has something to do and related to some kind of spiritual experience. Whether you hate that term or not, you have to realize at some point in your life you got to give in, because it's a thing. And I guarantee that's why most people are depressed, because they don't have that. You know, you may have a good relationship with your lover or wife or husband, but you wonder why you argue a lot and there's something missing. Because maybe you don't share a philosophy that there's something higher, or you don't participate in it. You know, let's say one of you is Buddhist, the other one's atheist, but you still love each other and that kind of thing. But you don't share that philosophy. You're always going to butt heads, and eventually the demons are going to come out and face each other. You're going to get on each other's nerves, because it's eventually going to lead to that. It always does. Whether you believe it or not. Because, you know, you're always going to have arguments with your loved ones, but if you don't take time to pull yourself outside your own bias and see their argument, have a strongman argument for them, and just ask why instead of telling them that this is the way it is, there's going to be problems, because we're all in a different form and body, and we all have different experiences, and you have to respect theirs. Because as soon as you argue against you're right and they're wrong, there's going to be a conflict, which you can feel inside that if it feels spoiled, you know, it's not like a good feeling. So all this revolves around that art, possessed by art, because it's in that same atmosphere, if you want to call it. Let's say, you know, consciousness and our concept of God and our concept of dreams and art and anything like in that, it seems like it always fits in the same kind of category. Just like logic fits in the category of math, science, logic, you know, architecture, things that are physical, they're all fit in another category. And it's interesting that our brain is divided into two hemispheres that kind of house those things, or at least receive information about those things and processes it. It's an amazing thing. And then you have the prefrontal cortex as the judge that sort of, you know, impedes you from going forward or makes decisions for you to go forward based upon your history and what you are about in this frame. The brain's an amazing concept, and then if you just look at everything physical in our world, streets, cities, it's all mapped out like a brain. Cities have, you know, big cities have a big light when you look above on a map, and it's like a synapses, you know, it's like, a neuron that's lit up, and then the cars going back and forth are like the synapses and the electricity and information going back and forth to each city. It's like Earth is a big brain. And I've always thought that, and I always thought the universe was a conscious being, and we're a part of this brain or consciousness that it's creating, and we're a part of it. And recently there was an article talking about that scientists are going to start studying that this possibly is a conscious figure, which is funny because science is thousands of years behind. Because, you know, Buddhists and Zen and a lot of Eastern philosophy and many others believe that to be true. It's just you can't prove it because it's hard to put your finger on it. Like, what do you measure? How do you measure it? The only way you can measure it is by asking people, you know, how they feel and how strong they feel about it and how important it is to their lives. But that's the problem. You're putting a scientific approach on something that isn't very scientific, if you will. If you want to say it in those terms. It's like grabbing a fish out of the ocean. It's slippery because it doesn't want to be. It's a living thing. It's a moving thing. It's always going. Whereas math seems, it's an abstract thing that represents stuff, and we can make it still, if you will, you know. It's not animate in our head except physics. So it's very slippery because evolution's always happening. It's like we're always unfolding like a flower. And what we've done with science and math is we've just, as the flower is growing, we take a picture of it. It's still growing. In that picture, we take out and use that thing, and well, this is still growing, and then this thing. That's why science always has to change, because nature is always changing, and so we're just taking all these pictures, trying to keep up with the growth and the expansion of it all, and it's a tough thing. So, you know, as I got older, you know, I found more artists that were just possessed. And there are some that even, they go into hiding and just, that's all they do. I mean, I've had this obsession with mentally ill artists my whole life. You know, Van Gogh, and then there was a gentleman named Darger. That one's a controversial one. It's not my style, what he paints, but I found him fascinating because he was a janitor, mentally ill. I'm not sure what his diagnosis was, and apparently what I've read, he wasn't very intelligent, but you know, who knows? His literacy might have been low. He might not be able to speak real well, but he had these profound images in books he would write. He wrote a 15,000 page book with illustrations about this fantasy world he made up. And I think it's called the Vivian Girls. It's controversial because he used a lot of nude children in his drawings. I mean, he didn't use real ones. He just drew them. And some were saying that he possibly still had this like childlike brain, because just the way he saw adults was like a child. You know, when we're all kids, we saw adults as the enemy sometimes, and he portrayed a lot of that in his book, that children were oppressed and adults were the problem. And I think, you know, and if you want to take a psychological analysis of that, I think it had something to do with like never lose your childlike wonder and creativity, but don't be immature. There's a difference between creativity and keeping yourself similar to your wondrous mind when you were a kid versus, you know, being a bully or crying when you don't get something. You don't want to keep those traits, but you want to keep that wonder trait, which is a part of that childlike spectrum, I guess, in that way of thinking. But anyway, and what I've read with him, he's never done anything sexual with anyone, so but it doesn't matter. It's just the amount of work he did, the obsession he had, and he didn't get paid nothing. I think he got paid $5 a week or something like that. He was living in something he would call equivalent to an SRO in the big cities. Small room, and he would just draw and write. And, you know, I think he had a friend he would talk to, but that was it. He didn't have many friends. So what is that? He's just possessed by doing this thing, but didn't care to talk to anyone. Like I said, I think he had a disdain for humans in a way, because he saw how ridiculous humans could be. But we all know that's true as well, but he has to still participate, because I think what you should be doing is, with this knowledge you're creating, you should participate in the world in order to maybe influence someone to be able to observe themselves to become a better person. Because our jobs, I think, is to make everything better around us. It's sort of a Buddhist type of approach where, you know, wherever you are, always make that place better than when you left it. Make the place better than before you left, you know. That doesn't make sense. But anyways, make the place better that you were in before you leave. And so I always thought that approach would be good. Like any apartment or house I rent, I always make sure I add a little something better than what it was before. Like if there was a sink broke, I'll fix it. People complain like they should fix it, and the land, sometimes they don't give a shit. I'm not saying spend thousands of dollars to fix a place that's not yours, but just make it a little bit better for yourself as best as you can, no matter what. With anything and everything. So that was his fault of just being too internalized too much. You see that a lot in artists, but then you have extroverted artists like Salvador Dali and Diego Rivera. But again, they were possessed by something too, politics and the zeitgeist. So both versions still are possessed by something. They're extreme in their thing. Like, it's the energy, the force, the fire driving them forward. So, yeah, there's Francis Bacon is another artist. He was extroverted, but he was dark. He had a lot of dark fantasies and twisted social views about his family. I think he was abused or something, and he was attracted to his father, and it was very strange. So obviously, he was raised by bad parents, and so your kids are very, very moldable when they're little, and if you instill anything negative, it's going to manifest through time, and then they don't realize it's actually a bad thing because it's normal to them. And when it's normalized, that's the problem, because then when you go talk to friends, they're like, well, what's wrong with this guy? And if you know anything about Francis Bacon, his paintings are very disturbing until later on in his life when he found love, but it seemed to be a lot of trauma from when he was a child, and he was off-putting, he was drinking all the time, smoking, and I don't know if he took any hard drugs, but again, he was possessed by something. He was wrestling with something. He was wrestling with his own mind, and I think that's also why later on art pulled me in, because I was always drawing nudes and beauty. I felt like I wasn't really dealing with my personal issues, though. It was just more of an escape. But later on, and especially now, I'm doing the opposite. I'm not escaping in the art. I'm dealing with things that I'm personally dealing with, and what I think other people are dealing with in this, in an ontological way, what we're all experiencing, and try and tune into that and find these commonalities of what I experience against what great thinkers may have thought and what people do think. But when I go outside, I don't feel like most people are possessed by anything like that anymore. Very few people. And when I meet people like that, I just want to hold on to them and be like, you are very rare. How can I keep you as my friend? And how can we continue to talk? And most people are caught up in activities and in politics and in a power game of I win and you lose, my team's better than yours. But I don't see that everywhere. I went to I make sure I go to visit small towns that seem to be doing well and to see what makes them work. Like not too long ago, I went to a little town called Holland, Michigan. It's about 30,000 people. It's a charter town, which means it's its own self-governing town. I don't know how that works exactly. I really do need to look into that. So I believe you have to pay higher taxes, and the schools I heard are better. Usually chartered town schools are a lot better. But anyway, what I noticed is everyone seemed to know each other. Everyone that walked by me said hi, looked me in the eye, and actually genuinely cared about my well-being. Some people, when you go to a big city, hey, how was your weekend? And it was very scripted and shallow, just to kind of like, oh shit, there's a human in front of me, I gotta say something. Just say the acceptable script and then I can move on. Whereas when I was in Holland, it was the opposite. People paid attention to who you were and where you were. They don't lose sight of you. And I found that same thing in Reykjavik too, where I was walking on the docks one summer and I went to the cafe to do some writing. And there was a guy there and he said, hey, I saw you walking earlier today at the docks. I was like, what the fuck? Why are you paying attention to me in that kind of, and talk to me about that? It was just interesting. Like, people pay attention in smaller towns about who's around you, but when you're in a big city, it's like people are blur. And so I realized, not every small town's like that. The small town I grew up in it's strange. It's definitely it's about middle lower class overall. I wouldn't say absolute poverty or anything, but there's some poor people there and uneducated. So it's only 8,000 people, which you would think, oh, they're probably really friendly. So there's variables. It's not just size. It's also education, income, and and community. And if you're tight, it seems to flourish. And so you don't just look at the population size. You got to look at the education side of it, and to see if it's a place people stay, and to create a culture. Because some people, as soon as they turn 18, they want to leave their town. They don't want to be there anymore. And that's what I did, because the small town that I grew up in was not very friendly. I didn't grow up there my whole life. I was only there 6-7 years. Before that, I was in another small town who was a little, I wouldn't say friendly, but it was kind of in between. People talked to you, but there was some racism and there was some dark stuff going on. It was definitely a different color and experience than the other place I moved to, but anyway, it seems like there's certain places in the world that have that sweet spot. There's not too many people. They're educated. They're aware. They understand the human condition better than most, and that's important. They value that versus value money and individualism. Now, individualism is good to a point, but I just think what overall is people don't understand how to break out of these mindsets and kind of move around their own brain, if you will, and to explore those things. But I think to do that, you need to have some sort of core structure. You need to have values. You need to have virtue. So, but yeah, I think for anyone who is feeling any despair, lonely, broken, like they know there's something wrong, they may have a good job, but they know there's something wrong. They're not leaving their home. They're not going somewhere different, even if it's local. Just walk around, take a bike, take an art class, get involved in the community. And this is what I'm going to do after my album. It's I'm not involved in the community as much, but because I need to start doing what I'm preaching, but I'm just so caught up in my own thing now, and I'm starting to see this, and I'm talking about this because I'm starting to see it manifest again and again. Anytime I go into a big project alone, where this project I'm mostly alone, I have other people working with me, but I don't see them physically because they're in a different state for now, until everything clears up after the album. And I'm going to immerse myself in the community, and then, I'll have a podcast basically talking about my experience of immersing myself back in the community after being kind of... COVID was interesting because it coincided with my album creation, so it was like, well, I was going to be isolated anyway, but I started to see the importance of exploring and meeting new people and being involved in a community that cares. And so we'll just leave it at that. So hopefully in the next 3 or 4 weeks I'll be finished with my album. That way I can immerse myself more in these talks. And I'm going to have a guest coming on soon. I think probably around September is when it's going to start happening, where I'm going to get guests and kind of blow this up a little more. This is just like an experiment for me to learn how to speak better on the fly, also increase my vocabulary if I can, because there's a lot of things I want to work on to become a better speaker. And it's not just to impress people, but it's to create a more rich experience for my brain and for your brain, because you're along with the ride. I'm not trying to tell people what to do. And that's why I need guests, because I want to learn to create an idea with two different minds. And, there's a method of argument or debate where you have thesis and antithesis, and then something comes out of that which is the solution. And because, you hear that saying that usually the truth is in the middle, and it's true. You have someone who's extremely on one side, and the other person's extremely on the other side. And usually if they're really strong about it, that means they're only saying half the story. And you bring two people together, and then if they can let go of their bias and see the other person's side, you'll notice that it always comes out in the middle, or a gradation of the two. And that's a beautiful thing, because it's kind of like mate pairing, if you will, when a female male come together and have a child. It's like two different sides of an idea. One's feminine, one's masculine. And I'm not talking about gender when I say this next thing. It's more about like masculine being more rigid and logical, and the female being more liberal and dreamy and romance and that kind of thing. And putting those two things together to create a new thing, which is a child.